On August 18, 1590, John White returned to Roanoke Island after nearly 3 years away. He expected to find his daughter, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, and more than 100 English settlers. It was Virginia's third birthday, but the shoreline answered him with wind, surf, and silence. Inside the settlement, buildings had been dismantled, pathways stood empty, and no colonist came to meet him. Then White saw one word carved deeply into a wooden palisade post: Croatoan. There was no clear battlefield, no waiting survivors, and no bodies explaining what had happened. For centuries, people said the colony vanished without a trace, but Roanoke did leave a trace. The real mystery is why England failed to follow it and what happened after the settlers left. 3 years earlier, the colonists had sailed west, expecting to build their settlement near Chesapeake Bay. Roanoke was meant to be only a stop, but pilot Simon Fernandez refused to carry them farther. Families and supplies were left at a place already damaged by an earlier English occupation. As the vessel turned away, Roanoke was no longer a temporary stop. It had become their home. They unloaded food, tools, household chests, and everything needed to build an agricultural community. But the site carried the remains and the consequences of an earlier English military settlement. They repaired the abandoned structures and tried to create a permanent town for families. Their survival depended on relationships with nearby indigenous communities, especially the Croatoan people. They possessed the food networks, local knowledge, and geography the newcomers desperately needed. Soon after arrival, colonist George Howe was killed while searching for food near the water. The English answered with an armed raid against a village they believed had supported the attack, but they struck friendly Croatoans, damaging one of the few alliances the colony could not afford to lose. The colony now depended on people it had just given another reason not to trust it. Inside Roanoke, isolation turned every barrel of food and every container of water into a calculation. Then, on August 18, a child was born inside the struggling settlement. Virginia Dare became the first English child born in England's claimed territory of Virginia. Her birth offered hope, but winter was approaching, food was uncertain, and the colony needed help. The settlers persuaded Governor John White to sail back to England and secure desperately needed supplies. Before he left, they agreed to carve the name of their destination into a tree or wooden post. If they were forced away in extreme danger, they would add a cross beside the message. They also discussed dividing, with one group remaining nearby and another moving farther inland. White expected to return within months. Instead, this farewell would last almost 3 years. White sailed for England believing he could gather supplies and return before the colony faced winter alone. The Atlantic crossing consumed precious weeks, while the settlers remained beyond England's reach. When White reached England, he expected to organize a relief voyage quickly, but England was preparing for war with Spain, and almost every available vessel had another purpose. Ships were seized for defense, and White's request for immediate rescue was pushed aside. In 1588, he finally secured a small relief attempt, but the expedition was dangerously underpowered. Before reaching Roanoke, the relief vessel was attacked and badly damaged. White returned to England again, while the colony received neither supplies nor an explanation. At Roanoke, the settlers waited without knowing why England had failed to return. Then an extraordinary drought began to weaken crops, reduce fresh water, and tighten the colony's food supply. Indigenous communities facing the same drought would also have had less food to trade or share. Roanoke's isolation was becoming a survival crisis for everyone in the region, not only the English. White could not secure another passage until 1590, almost 3 years after leaving his family. When he finally returned, the first signs were confusing. Smoke appeared above the island, but as the search party approached, no settlers answered their calls. The houses had not been smashed by a sudden attack. They had been deliberately taken apart. The colonists' own boats were missing, suggesting that they had used them to leave the island. A defensive wooden palisade had also been constructed around the abandoned settlement. On a nearby tree, White found 3 carved letters, CRO. Then, on one of the palisade posts, he found the complete word, Croatoan. Most important, White found no cross, the signal the colonists had agreed to leave if they departed under extreme danger. Some buried chests had been opened and damaged, leaving White's books, maps, and belongings exposed to rain. White believed the destruction happened later. To him, the carved word was not a warning. It was an address. Croatoan was a real island and community associated with Manteo, one of the English colony's closest indigenous allies. White immediately wanted to sail south toward Croatoan and search for his family, but worsening weather, rough seas, and the loss of anchors made the short journey increasingly dangerous. Without secure anchors, the ship could not safely hold position near the shallow and treacherous coast. The privateer crew chose to preserve the vessel, forcing White to leave before reaching the destination. One group may have moved south toward Croatoan, using the colony's missing boats to cross the coastal waters. Some may have reached the Croatoan community and sought protection, food, or a place to survive. If part of the colony reached Croatoan, their first challenge would have been gaining permission to enter an independent community. Any landing would likely have been cautious, controlled, and shaped by the community already living there. For exhausted settlers, water and temporary safety may have mattered before any deeper alliance could begin. They may first have lived at the settlement's edge, dependent on local permission and limited resources. Survival would have required adapting to Croatoan fishing, farming, and food preservation knowledge. Assimilation, if it occurred, would have been gradual, not an instant disappearance of English identity. Over time, some survivors may have entered a pattern of shared work and mutual protection, but an English object on Hatteras can prove contact or trade. By itself, it cannot reveal who carried it there. Another group may have followed the earlier plan and traveled roughly 50 miles into the mainland. The waterways of Albemarle Sound offered a route toward the Chowan River and present-day Bertie County. If an inland party existed, it would have followed forested creeks and rivers deeper into the mainland. Instead of rebuilding one visible town, they may have separated into small household farms along the waterways. Such households could explain why civilian English objects later appeared far from Roanoke Island. Centuries later, imaging revealed a small fort-like symbol hidden beneath the paper correction on John White's map. At nearby Site X, archaeologists recovered Elizabethan period ceramics and other European material. A late 16th century German cloth seal is especially suggestive of civilian English presence in the region. At Site Y, the First Colony Foundation reports a much larger concentration of Elizabethan material. In June 2026, the Foundation declared the lost colony found, but that is not the same as identifying every colonist. In June 2026, the Foundation declared the lost colony found, but that is not the same as identifying every colonist. Their final stories remain unknown. Next, we investigate Jamestown's starving time and how another English colony nearly disappeared.